Kris Kelso is a keynote speaker, an author, a two-time entrepreneur, a professional certified coach, and a mentor to leaders around the world. He's a faculty instructor at the Professional Christian Coaching Institute, an advisor and instructor at the Nashville Entrepreneur Center, and is a contributing writer for Fast Company magazine, Yahoo Finance, and the Nashville Business Journal. He's the author of Overcoming the Imposter, Silence the Inner Critic, and Lead with Confidence. That's what we're going to focus on today. But he also told me he has an unusually specific willpower, having not eaten a single donut in the past 17 years. So Kris, welcome. But I got to ask, what's with the donuts, man?
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here. Yeah, the donut thing is kind of funny. Years ago, I wanted to be healthier, but I hate dieting. I hate trying to anything around, counting calories or being on a really strict diet just is too much effort and too annoying for me, too restrictive. But I just decided that if I could cut out one really unhealthy thing, like just pick one thing and go cold turkey, then I would be just a little bit healthier. And at the time I was working at this business that was right next to or just down the road from a Krispy Kreme donuts. And so there were donuts there all the time. And so I just thought, I'm going to see how long I can go without eating a donut. It was just I'm just going to not eat this. I still eat cake, cookies, pie, whatever, but no donuts. And after a year, I thought, well, that wasn't all that hard. Let's see if I can go another year. And then eventually, 5, 6, 10, now 17 years, somebody offers me a donut. I'm like, I'm not going to break this streak for one donut. That's just not worth it. So yeah, 17 years since I've eaten a donut and
So
I
you
don't
had
really
the
miss.
choice. I hope you don't mind me sharing this. You had the choice of stopping the heroin or the donuts, and you said, nah,
Exactly.
the
Well,
donuts.
I wanted it to be achievable. I had to be realistic.
I thought maybe like you had a tragic donut accident as a child, but now I get it. It's
No,
good.
no
That's good. You're a
nothing quite that fun
better
of a
man than
story.
I. So off donuts onto imposter syndrome. So what drove you to write Overcoming the Imposter?
Mm. So, for anybody who's not familiar, which it seems these days that just about everybody has heard of imposter syndrome at least, but I'll define it really quickly. It's a feeling that maybe I'm not what everyone thinks that I am, that I'm just making it up as I go, and I'm worried or afraid that people are going to figure that out and they're going to realize that I don't really know what I'm doing. And what happens is when you have imposter syndrome, you tend to overvalue other people's success and undervalue or even doubt the reality of your own success. And despite the evidence that you're successful, you feel like, well, it's mostly been luck or just good timing or relationships or, I've had a lot of help along the way, which reality check, we've all had a lot of help along the way and we've all had elements of luck in our success stories and those kind of things. So imposter syndrome was something that years ago I didn't know anything about it, hadn't heard of it, but I was definitely experiencing it. I started a business in my early 30s with no business training whatsoever. I don't even have a college degree, never went to college. And so I literally went to a bookstore and bought a stack of books covering everything that I thought I needed to know to run a small business and just started reading and figured I'll just figure it out. And whatever I needed to know, whatever I thought I needed to learn, I just figured out a way to learn it. But I always had this persistent fear that there was some big idea, some key concept that I was missing and it was going to be my undoing, that one day someone would figure out that I didn't know business school 101. And so that was going to disqualify me from being an entrepreneur. And it wasn't until years later that someone told me about imposter syndrome and explained what it was. And just hearing about it and understanding that lots of people experience it. Some studies say 70 to 80% of the population. B, it's more prevalent among high achievers. So if you experience imposter syndrome, it's actually a sign that you're pushing the boundaries, that you're driven, that you're trying new things. And just realizing that it was a real thing and that I wasn't alone in that was a huge relief and a weight off my shoulders. But that wasn't enough. I really started to dig in and study this topic because I wanted to understand it. I'm kind of a psychology nut a little bit, I'm again, I don't have a degree in that, but I love to study psychology and human behavior. And so I started digging into imposter syndrome for me to understand it. But then as I began to talk to some of my clients and other entrepreneurs that I knew, I started getting this feedback and response that it was a really prevalent challenge and that a lot of people were wrestling with it and that not a lot of people understood it. And so I'm a person, Mike, that reads a lot of books, especially business books and leadership books. And I'm constantly recommending books to my friends and clients and colleagues. And I looked and couldn't really find a great book on imposter syndrome that spoke to my tribe, to entrepreneurs and really driven, innovative people. And there just wasn't one that I felt like met that need. And so eventually it became a compulsion. Like this book needed to exist and it didn't. So it became my responsibility to write it.
Yeah, I love that. We write what we need to read. If it's not out
Absolutely.
there, we write it. And it's so interesting that, I could remember, man, it was probably I'm 58. It was probably 30 years ago or so when I was in management consulting. And I didn't know what the name of this thing was, but I just knew any minute. And by the way, I got my college degree, but I never got an MBA. And I had these
Yeah.
folks around me that all had their MBAs. And
Yes.
I'm in management consulting and I'm sitting at my computer typing away at something. And I had this fear that any minute someone was going to tap me on the back and go, wait a minute, we just figured out you don't know anything. Get
Yeah.
out of here. And felt that actually for years. And when I had finally kind of got up the guts to tell somebody else, that's how I was feeling. Cause I say
Yeah.
that and we laugh, but it's a horrible feeling.
Yeah.
And when I finally got up the guts to tell somebody else that, they went, "Oh, yeah, I've had that for a lot." That's called imposter syndrome. And
Mm,
just somebody putting a name on it was like, "Oh, I'm not crazy. I'm not alone.
right.
Other people feel this way." Now, you said something interesting I want to dig into a little bit is why is it, do you think, that it is kind of leaders and high achievers
Mm,
that feel this more often? Because that might sound a little counterintuitive.
yeah. So there's 3 reasons that I think entrepreneurs in particular, but also just leaders in general and high achievers, innovators experience imposter syndrome. One is that they're pushing the boundaries. They're trying new things. Entrepreneurs by nature are risk takers and leaders have to be willing to step into new situations and to try new things. And so they're in unknown territory more often than the average person. They're, entrepreneur or imposter syndrome is the fear that you're in over your head. Well, if you're a leader, you are intentionally getting in over your head on a regular basis. Like you're sort of the edge of that spear cutting into new territory. The second reason is that they're put on a pedestal and they are often looked up to, admired. People assume that a business owner or a business leader, a CEO, or even a senior manager, they assume that you're in that position because you know more than everyone else, because you have the answers that other people don't have. And they also are just sort of looked up to as the smartest people in the room, the ones that are the most capable, when in reality, they're often figuring it out as they go. They're in new territory, they're breaking new ground, they're trying and experimenting things. And then the third reason is that they're often in sales mode. They're, whether you're in sales officially or not, leaders have to be salespeople in the sense that they're selling a vision, they're selling their ideas, they're recruiting people to join their team. If you're an entrepreneur, you might be selling your business in terms of raising money, pitching investors. And so that combination of being in sales mode means you're constantly telling the best version of your story that you can, even when you know that behind the scenes there are some cracks and flaws and some issues that you're still working through. But being in sales mode, being in new territory where you don't always fully know what you're doing and being put on a pedestal by others where you feel like the admiration you get may not be completely warranted, like they see more in you than is really there. That combination of those 3 things is just this lethal formula for self-doubt and feeling like, "Oh my goodness, I'm at risk of being exposed here."
That makes so much sense. And even that in and of itself, before we get to and we will get to your ideas on how you overcome this, but just the understanding of the reasons why it might happen to you,
Yeah.
that in of itself, I think should make people feel better that, oh, it's because I'm trying new things. So that's
Yes.
amazing. And so let me ask this before we get to how to solve it. I want to talk about the impact a little bit, and I want to talk
Mm,
about it at two levels. First is as an individual, how does this idea of imposter syndrome impact us?
yeah.
But then, because a lot of the folks listening to this show are leaders or part of
Yes.
a leadership team, I want to understand too if you as a leader have imposter syndrome that you are not working on to kind of get over that, how does it impact the rest of the company? How does it impact the people you're leading? But first, let's talk about as an individual. So, how does having imposter syndrome impact an individual?
So it individually, it's going to create a lot of stress, anxiety, right? You're spending energy managing your image and worrying about what people are thinking and how what you do comes across. And that energy is not being used at actually doing productive work so it's like you're hedging constantly, you're guarding yourself, you're protecting. It's also going to make you more risk averse. You're going to be less willing to share an idea that isn't fully thought through, or to try something where there's an equal chance of failure as there is of success. But failure is how we learn. Experimentation is how we get to the right answer eventually. But if you're so afraid of being exposed as a fraud, or, worried that you're going to lose people's respect, you're going to be very risk averse, and you're going to play it safer, and you're going to spend your time and energy managing your reputation and your image rather than experimenting your way to success. And so that's how it holds us back individually.
Now, let me say
Eh,
something before we go to the team and the company. So, it
Yeah.
sounds to me like if you're spending that time worried about and managing your reputation, not taking those risks, it's almost a vicious cycle that if you don't deal with that, that problem is not only not going to get better, it's going to get worse. Because
Yes.
as you're more worried about managing your reputation, you are probably not showing up out there the way you should. And the whole
Yes.
problem is just going to cycle down pretty quickly.
That's exactly true. And in fact, in the book, I've got several stories, and there's one that comes to mind of a man who was quickly rising in his industry and part of a very large company. And he was having great success, but his insecurity, his imposter syndrome became debilitating to the point that he was avoiding meetings. He was delaying projects. He was not holding himself accountable to deadlines because he was afraid to take on the work. He was afraid to turn in the work because of how he feared it being wrong or being misperceived. That became this self-sabotaging behavior that eventually cost him his job. He got fired because of a lack of confidence, because he was holding back, and it was all rooted in this fear that I'm in over my head, I don't know what I'm doing, when in fact, he was doing a great job and he was very capable. And, as we bridge to the question about the leaders, in that specific story, he ended up finding his way to another company in the industry where the cycle began to happen again. But fortunately, this time he had a great boss, a CEO, who saw that in him and pulled him aside and said, "Hang on, you are capable of this, and you cannot let your self doubt start to create this cycle." Like, the leader actually saw and short circuited that downward spiral and helped him to get out of that cycle of insecurity that leads to poor performance, which breeds more insecurity. And so he was able to flourish in the right environment because someone saw that in him and counteracted it.
Love that because without that leader, that mentor to help him, I would imagine him getting fired from that job
Yeah,
probably just reinforced, see, I'm not very good.
exactly. And this is often what happens is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm not good enough, therefore I do low quality work, and then I lose out on opportunities. I have limits and boundaries put on myself, which reinforce the idea that I'm not good enough. But it often starts in our heads. It starts with that self doubt that plays out in the way we perform.
And from a leadership standpoint, there's another angle that just jumped in my head too. So two angles. One is as a leader, if you have imposter syndrome, let's talk a little bit about how that impacts your team and your people.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, as a leader, how can you recognize if someone on your team has imposter syndrome?
Mm,
Right.
yes.
So, but let's go with the first thing. So, if you're a leader and you have imposter syndrome and the nature of that is you're very much focused on yourself,
Yep.
what impact could that be having on your team?
So, one of the things that happens when you have imposter syndrome, especially in a leadership role, is you try to demonstrate confidence where you don't have it, and you try to project expertise. So, you end up in this, Carol Dweck calls it the fixed mindset, where you try to project that you have all the answers, you set yourself up as flawless, you sort of, exude this outward confidence that is rooted in an inward insecurity. And the problem with that is most people can see through it. So your people will lose trust in you when you pretend like you have it all together and you actually don't. They'll recognize that, and they may not confront you. They may not tell you that you're losing their trust, but over time, you will lose their trust and their respect because they know inherently that everybody has flaws, everybody has weaknesses. And when a person is unwilling to admit a flaw or a weakness, then we know that they not only have flaws and weaknesses, but also insecure or dishonest on top of that. And so, as a leader, when you try to project or pretend to be perfect, flawless, knowledgeable, have all the answers, all the experience, when you're unwilling to admit a weakness or a shortcoming, you actually erode the trust of your team, which erodes the effectiveness of your team. Team effectiveness is built on trust and on the health of those relationships. So you'll lose the thing you're trying to get when you pretend, when you put on the mask, when you're trying to get that respect, you're trying to, and you actually push it away, you erode that respect. On
Interesting.
the hand, what I've seen is people respect leaders who are vulnerable and authentic so much more than they respect leaders who pretend to have it all together and pretend to have it all figured out. So when as a leader you let your guard down and you say, "Hey guys, I don't have the answer here, but we're going to try some things and we're going to see what works and we're going to figure it out together. I believe in us. I believe in our capability to figure this out, but that doesn't mean I have all the right answers. We're going to have to learn this together." Or I have a weakness and a shortcoming in this area. I'm not great at this, so I've hired these people to help and I've brought in the people around me to make up for, the areas that I'm not as strong. When a leader is authentic like that, it actually builds trust, creates that team health and that open dialogue. And they set the stage and the culture that it's okay to ask for help and admit that you have a shortcoming or an area where you're struggling. And that enables your team as well to sort of drop those walls and get vulnerable and ask for the help that they need rather than spending a lot of energy trying to cover up for their shortcomings.
So, how do you get there, right? How do you get from this feeling of, this insecurity that you have
Mhm.
to being more vulnerable? Because I sense being vulnerable is at the heart of the answer to how you overcome this.
Yeah.
How do you flip that switch from, I don't think I'm as smart as everybody else thinks I am, so I don't want to let people know, to, I'm going to admit I don't know a whole bunch of stuff. And that's going to sound like, how do you make that happen?
Yeah, there's a series of mindset shifts that you've got to make. And one of the first is about how you view failure, about what you see as the result and even the purpose and the benefits of failure. So, people that struggle with imposter syndrome are really afraid of failure. They're afraid of a public failure or a failure that is exposed, that exposes a weakness in them. But failure is not something we should be afraid of. And failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is part of the process. of success. Failure is a great teacher. We learn more from failures than we do from successes. And so one of the mindset shifts is to reframe failure as learning. So when I take on a new project, and it has taken me a while to get to this place, but when I take on a new project, a new effort, when I try something new that I haven't done before, I tell myself there are only two outcomes. I'm either going to succeed or I'm going to learn. One of those two things is going to happen. Maybe both, but at least one of those things is going to happen. And both are a success. Both are a win for me. And so when you reframe failure as learning, and if you can create a culture in your organization that failure is learning, then people are more willing to take a risk. Now, I don't mean take irresponsible risks. I don't mean just, throw caution to the wind and try anything. But what I mean is be willing to step out even when the certainty of success is low. And there is that risk that it may not go the way we expect it to, but that's how we learn. So you start with this reframing of failure as learning. And then the other mental shift that you need to make, once you've reframed failure as learning, then you can start to draw your confidence, not from what you know, but from your ability to figure it out. So the second mental shift is that your confidence doesn't come from what you know and what you've done. Your confidence comes from your ability to learn and your ability to figure things out. So this is again where when I try something new, I don't think about, have I done this before? And do I have enough confidence that I'm going to be successful? I think about, how many other things have I done before for the first time? How many other times have I tried something and maybe it didn't go exactly the way I planned the first time around, but I eventually figured out how to make it work. I eventually learned my way through it and got good at it. And that enables me to boldly try something new, knowing that whether it works the first time or not, I'm in the learning process. And so as a leader, here again, when you project to your team that our confidence comes from our experience and our knowledge and what we have, well, then you've just put serious boundaries and limits on your confidence because you haven't done it all and you don't know it all. But when you say our confidence comes from our ability to learn and experiment and to figure things out, you've just thrown the boundaries off. You said anything we're willing to go apply the effort to figure out, we can now do, both as an individual, as a leader, and as a team, as an organization. And that really frees people up to not fear failure, but to see it as part of the process and that learning journey where we experiment our way to success.
Love it. Love it. So reframing failure as learning and reframing confidence is the ability to, I mean, I love, and both those fit together very nicely.
Yes.
So, so if I've got imposter syndrome right now, and I
Mm,
know I've got to make these two mindset shifts, let's
yeah.
get really pragmatic. So what's the first thing I ought to, and those are going to allow me to be more vulnerable, which
Mhm.
instead of that vicious cycle that's going down or that self-fulfilling prophecy, that what's the opposite of a vicious cycle? A virtuous cycle. There it
A
is. The
virtuous
virtuous
cycle.
cycle going up. So what's the actual first step I ought to take if I'm mired in imposter syndrome? What do I do? What do I do as soon as I'm done listening to this podcast?
This is going to sound hard to do. This is going to be harsh for someone. They're looking for an easy step, but it's a simple step, but it's not an easy one. And that step is to tell someone, to simply open up and admit it and have a conversation with someone, preferably someone you trust, but talk to someone about where your struggle is. And Mike, you've hit on the key word multiple times. You've said vulnerability. And this is the great irony of imposter syndrome, is that imposter syndrome is the fear of vulnerability. It's the fear of being exposed for who and what you really are. And yet vulnerability is the antidote. Vulnerability is the cure for imposter syndrome. And here's why. Because when you've got a mask on, when you're pretending, when you're projecting the most confidence and you're trying to appear that you're flawless and that you have a perfect plan and you've got it all together, even when people compliment you, when they tell you do good work, when they admire you, you can't accept it. You don't really believe it because you know it's based on a half truth. You know it's not based on reality about who you are. It's based on just the image that you're putting out there. But when you begin to get vulnerable and you say, I have some struggles. I have some things. I have some areas I am really confident. And then I have some areas that I'm not, that I'm still learning, that I'm still figuring out. When you are authentic with people and they still admire you and respect you, which, by the way, they usually will. Because again, we talked about people respect leaders who are vulnerable and authentic a lot more than they respect those leaders that are projecting confidence. When they respect and admire you, it will feel much more real. You'll be able to accept it because you know it's based on the truth and it'll actually boost your confidence. So, being vulnerable can be a confidence booster. Now, it's not without risk. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that if you get vulnerable and honest and you tell somebody, I have a weakness, I have a shortcoming, there's some areas that I really don't know what I'm doing. I'm not going to tell you that can't hurt you, that won't backfire in certain circumstances. But what I will tell you is the benefits far outweigh the risks. That 99% of the time, being vulnerable is going to help you more than it hurts you. And you'll see that what happens is other people begin to say, oh, you know what? I'm glad you said that because I've struggled there too. Or they'll say, that's not my issue, but here's where I struggle. And maybe if you help me with mine, I can help you with yours and we can talk and we can support one another. And you start to realize that the flaws that you have that you think are the big, ugly, fatal flaws, that you think are the insurmountable weaknesses, that they're really not that big a deal. And that lots of other people have worked their way through that as well. And that really all you needed to do was open up and ask for some help, and you'll be able to find it.
One of the things, Kris, I love about this is something, yes, we're talking about imposter syndrome, but what you're talking about is, I think, one of the keys to building a great culture within an
Yeah.
organization. And when I talk about culture with my clients, I talk about the 3 V's: values, vision, and vulnerability. So I use
Yeah.
that word a lot here
Yeah.
because I use it a lot.
Yes.
And there's a great book after you finish reading, Chris's book and then my book. Read this. I'm going to mention it's a great book. A guy named Daniel Coyle called The Culture
Mm.
Code, and he
Yeah.
talks about something called the trust loop. I think he calls it the trust loop. He may even call it the vulnerability loop, but I think it's the trust loop. But it's this whole idea, Kris, you're talking about of, if I trust you and I say, "Hey, gotta be honest with you, Kris, I'm really no good at this part of what we're doing. I could really use some help."
Hmm.
Or, "I think I may have screwed up," or, "I need some," whatever it is. If I trust you, you're gonna say, "Hey, Mike just trusted me." You might come back to me and go, "You know what? I've had that same problem, and let me tell you what I've done." Now, all
Yes.
that you're trusting me, and then I hear that, and I'm gonna trust you more, and that's just gonna create this beautiful trust loop. And if you can imagine doing that on a team,
Yeah.
you're creating this safe space for everybody on your team to share and be vulnerable in a good way. Vulnerable has this negative connotation, but we both mean it in a good way.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. In a good way. And, every now and then I will talk to a leader or hear from someone, and I'm talking about imposter syndrome and explaining this insecurity that is pervasive. And they'll say, well, that's not really an issue in our organization. I don't think nobody's talking about that. We don't have that problem in our company. And I instantly know a couple of things about that leader and that organization. Number one, I know that they are probably out of touch because statistically, 70 to 80% of the population experiences imposter syndrome at some point in their career. There's almost no way, it's a near statistical impossibility that you have an organization of any size where that's not happening. And so, what that means is that leader either is sort of willfully blind to what their people are wrestling with, or people are afraid to acknowledge that they have an insecurity, a fear, a weakness. And in either case, that's a problem for that leader. That's something that I want to encourage anybody who felt that way coming into this or is halfway through this conversation going, this doesn't apply to me. I want to really encourage you to examine yourself and ask yourself, is it really not an issue in my organization? Or am I just unaware of it because people don't feel safe that they can come and tell me? And a leader has the opportunity to open up that conversation by being the first to be vulnerable, to being the first to acknowledge that, hey, we have challenges. And so if you ask your organization, honestly, does anybody struggle with not feeling like they're worthy or not feeling like, and you got to create some safety, some psychological safety for them to open up to this. But if you feel like your organization doesn't have this problem, then that's probably a sign that it's very pervasive and you're just not able to see it because they don't feel like they can open up about that.
It also sounds to me, if a leader said that to me, I'm going to say that leader is probably, I hate to use a word like that, but ignorant of what imposter syndrome is, or maybe they've got
Yeah.
it themselves and they're
Yeah.
because if you understand what it is, you understand people aren't talking about it. That's part of the problem.
Yes.
So you've got to start that conversation. And I want to kind of loop it back around to something you said earlier, where studies have shown maybe it's 70%, of people that may feel that way. When you take that statistic and you take your recommendation on what the first step is, which is
Hmm.
tell somebody else, it ought to make you feel more comfortable telling someone else because
Yeah.
chances are pretty damn good that they're not only going to be understanding,
Yeah.
but they're probably going to say, you know what? I feel the same way, or I have felt
Yeah.
the same way. And maybe they were afraid to talk about it. So, man, maybe you're helping them out in the
Yes.
same way. So that's
Absolutely.
beautiful.
And this is one of the reasons that I chose to start talking publicly about this because I can say, number one, hey, here's an entrepreneur. I founded and run two different companies, and yet I struggled with imposter syndrome for a long time. And still, it comes up in certain circumstances where I have to really battle those self doubts. And so I want to open up that conversation for people. I just recently I spoke to, I won't say which one, but a major state university, a statewide university. I spoke to the entire faculty and staff of that university, and we did an anonymous poll, basically just explained what imposter syndrome was and said how many people struggle with this at some point, and it was 96%
Wow.
of the faculty and staff of a major state university said 96% of them. And so then I was able to say, look, everybody, here's the stats. So let's all just quit pretending that A, you don't deal with it. And B, if you do deal with it, you're the only one. Because neither one of those things is true for 96% of you. So just opening up that conversation and allowing people to speak freely is such a help and such a value. You unlock some fear and some insecurity and that risk aversion and that behavior of managing your image. You unlock those things for your people and allow them to talk freely. And that's the first step towards conquering this, towards, getting over those insecurities and fears is being able to talk about it, being open. One of the sinister things about imposter syndrome is that it makes you feel like you're the only one. The very nature of it is this fear that if I say something, I'm going to be the only one, that I'm going to be ostracized because everybody else is secure and confident and I'm not. And once you know that you're not the only one, and especially once you know that it's 96% of your colleagues, then it becomes a lot easier to just open up and have a conversation about it.
Yeah, it's almost like the problem is you're wearing this mask.
Yeah.
And the simple solution, which sounds a lot simpler than I'm saying it, is take the damn mask off.
Right.
You're not as ugly as you think you are. You're going to
Yeah.
take that mask off and you're going to realize you're beautiful, or you might realize everybody's just as crazy looking as you are.
Yeah.
Take the mask off. I love that. I love that. So, Kris, I know. So, Overcoming the Imposter is the book. It's what we've been talking about. I know that's not all you focus on, in your business.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how, who are your typical clients and how do you work with them?
Yeah. First and foremost, I'm a professional speaker and I do talk about imposter syndrome quite a bit. I've spoken on a number of topics over the years, but the last couple of years, especially since this book was published, that has been the main thing that I'm hired to speak on and talk to leadership conferences, private institutions, organizations, universities, etc. Secondly, I do some leadership coaching. I am a professional certified coach with the ICF. In fact, I teach coaching classes. As you mentioned in the bio, I'm on faculty with a coaching school. So I work one on one primarily with small business owners. And then occasionally I work with an entire leadership team of a small business doing things like goal setting, problem solving, team health, communication, really shoring up the health of that team so that they can be effective leaders.
Excellent. And this will be in the show notes, but I'll ask anyway, where someone wants to find out more about you or buy your
Yeah.
book, give us a couple of places they ought to go.
So I'm really easy to find online if you remember that my name starts with a K, Kris, Kelso, Kelso. And so I'm at kriskelso.com and I'm Kris Kelso on most of the social platforms. And you can also find specifically the book at overcomingtheimposter.com. And there's info on the book, on my keynote speech, some videos, and some other interviews that I've done, all available there. And in fact, on that Overcoming the Imposter website, you can get a free chapter of the book. And it's not the first chapter where, all I do is set up the problem and don't give you any solutions. It's actually chapter 7, which is one of the best chapters in the book. It's the one where we talk about reframing failure as learning and shifting your mindset, some of the things we talked about early in this conversation. So I'd encourage your listeners to go grab that free chapter because it is really, really powerful on its own, even if you don't end up reading the entire book, which of course you should anyway.
Beautiful. So reframe failure as learning. Confidence is the ability to figure it out. And right after you're done listening to this, if you have imposter syndrome, you suspect you have imposter syndrome, find someone, tell them about it. That's the first step to solve the
Yeah.
problem. Beautiful, beautiful. So, Kris, this was great. So helpful to, I hope, so many people. So, hey, thanks for coming on the show. This was great.
Thank you, Mike. I really enjoyed it. This was a great conversation.